Hi, and welcome to another episode of The Lowest Crime, a podcast all about the most notorious and tragic criminal cases from the Netherlands. I am Eline, and today's case left a void in the hearts of the entire country. It's a story of an innocent young boy leaving to go to a children's camp, never to be seen alive again. This is the deeply unsettling case of Nicky Verstappen, the 11-year-old boy whose tragic disappearance and death during a summer camp in 1998 became one of the most harrowing unsolved mysteries in Dutch criminal history, only to be solved 20 years later. Before we dive in, please note that today's episode discusses the death of a child, sexual abuse and prolonged investigations, which will be disturbing to some listeners. And of course, I always try my very best to bring you all the known facts, but I am just an amateur podcast creator, so there is always a chance of me making a mistake. So, let's dive in. Heibloem, a small village tucked away in the province of Limburg, was a place that most people would describe as peaceful, almost idyllic. With fewer than 1,000 residents, it was one of those close-knit communities where everyone knew each other by name. The village was framed by fields and woods, and it was a place where children roamed freely and parents felt confident letting them wander. But that peace was shattered in August of 1998, when Nicky Verstappen, an 11-year-old boy with a mop of brown hair and an infectious smile, vanished into the night, leaving only heartache and questions behind. Nicky Verstappen wasn't the type of boy to stand out in a crowd. He was shy and often quiet, but his kindness was what people remembered most. He was the sort of boy who would help a friend with their homework or share his lunch with someone who'd forgotten theirs. To those who knew him, he was a little dreamer, obsessed with soccer, especially Ajax, a Dutch soccer team, and determined to one day be a professional player himself. His favorite player was Jari Litmanen, and he would often be found kicking a ball around with his friends, lost in his fantasies of making the winning goal for his beloved team. But Nicky had another side to him as well. He was deeply attached to his home, especially to his younger sister Femke, and he struggled a lot with homesickness. That homesickness had kept him away from attending the previous year's summer camp organized by the Jos Brech Jeugdwerk, a local youth organization. He had spent the week sulking at home, missing out on all the games, the ghost stories, and the fun that his friends had enjoyed. This year, he had decided to be brave, to face the week away from home with determination, though the decision had been made with some trepidation. For the children in Heibloem, the Jos Brech Jeugdwerk summer camp was the highlight of the year. It was a week of freedom and adventure, of sleeping under the stars in large tents, playing sports, and building memories that would last a lifetime. For Nicky, it was also a chance to spend time with his closest friends, who had formed a tight-knit group called the Night Riders. They were inseparable, bonded by their shared love of soccer, mischief, and childhood innocence. But for all the excitement that Nicky felt, there was still part of him that was nervous about being away from home for an entire week. His parents had noticed the hesitation in his eyes as they dropped him off at the camp. His mother, Bertie, had given him a reassuring hug, promising him that the week would fly by and that he would be home before he even realized it. Nicky had smiled, hugged his parents tightly, and waved them off. The camp was held at the Heikop, a campsite surrounded by dense woods and located near the edge of Brunsumer Heide, a sprawling nature reserve that stretched across southern Limburg. The area was perfect for children to explore and play, with wide open spaces, hidden trails, and the feeling of being far removed from the rest of the world. For the first 2 days, everything went exactly as planned. The children played games, told stories around the campfire, and shared laughs as they bonded over the little dramas of the camp life. On the second night of the camp, August 10th, Nicky and his friends from the Night Riders were exhausted but happy as they crawled into their tent. The boys were nestled between the trees, their tents flanked by the tents of the camp leaders. And nearby was a communal area, where meals were shared and activities were organized. Here, the friends drifted off to sleep, their minds still buzzing from the excitement of the day, unaware of the looming tragedy that was about to unfold. At some point during the night, while his friends slept soundly in their sleeping bags, Nicky got up and left the tent. He was barefoot, his shoes and belongings still neatly arranged by his sleeping bag. No one saw him leave. No one heard him step into the night. By the time the other boys in the tent woke up the next morning, Nicky was gone. It was Ian, one of Nicky's closest friends, who first realized that something was wrong. It was early, just past 6 a.m., and the forest was still bathing in the soft light of dawn. Ian had woken up needing to go to the bathroom, and as he stretched and yawned, he glanced over at Nicky's sleeping bag, expecting to see his friend still curled up inside. But Nicky wasn't there. At first, Ian assumed that Nicky had simply gone to the bathroom as well, or was exploring the campgrounds. He didn't panic right away. After all, the camp was small, and the boys had promised each other that they'd stick together if anyone needed to venture out into the night. Still, something felt off. Minutes ticked by, and Ian began to feel a growing sense of unease. He shook the other boys awake, and they started looking around the immediate area, calling Nicky's name softly so they wouldn't wake any of the others. But Nicky didn't answer. His shoes were still by his bed, and there was no sign that he had taken anything with him. It was as if he had simply vanished. The boys ran to the camp leaders, who quickly realized the gravity of the situation. They organized a search, calling Nicky's name as they searched the campgrounds and the surrounding woods. But there was no sign of him. His disappearance was immediate and absolute. For Nicky's parents, Bertie and Peetje, the morning of August 11th started out like any other. They were home relaxing, assuming their son was safe and enjoyed his time at camp. Nothing could have prepared them for the phone call they received that day at 8:30 a.m. The voice on the other end was one of the camp leaders, and it was a call that no parent should ever have to receive. Nicky is missing, they were told. In an instant, their world crumbled. The panic that gripped them was indescribable. They dropped everything and raced to the campsite, hearts pounding, minds racing through every possible explanation, every terrible scenario. As they sped towards the heikop, they could barely comprehend what was happening. When they arrived, they were greeted by a scene of quiet panic. The camp leaders were frantically organizing search parties, and the children were huddled together, whispering nervously as the police had been called in. Officers started combing through the woods, looking for any sign of the missing boy. Nicky's parents, Bertie and Peetje, could do nothing but hope. They joined the search, calling Nicky's name, and their voices were raw with fear and desperation. But hour after hour passed, and there was still no sign of their son. Word of Nicky's disappearance spread like wildfire through Heibloem. In a small village like this, news travels fast, and by mid-morning the entire community was mobilized. Friends, neighbors, and even strangers from nearby towns arrived to help in the search. Cars lined the streets leading to the camp, and volunteers spread out across the Brunsumer Heide, scouring the fields and forest for any trace of Nicky. The Brunsumer Heide was an enormous area, nearly 6,000 acres of woods, heathland and sand dunes, and as the day wore on, the magnitude of the search began to sink in. The landscape was vast, and Nicky could be anywhere. The local police had called in search dogs, and helicopters started circling overhead, and the entire region seemed to come together in a desperate bid to find him. It was a race against time, and every hour that passed without any trace of him made it harder to keep believing in a positive outcome. It wasn't until around 9 p.m. on August 11th, 36 hours after Nicky was last seen, that one of the searchers stumbled upon something in the undergrowth, nearly a kilometer from the campsite, bringing the search to a heart-stopping conclusion. It was the body of a young boy, lying face down in a small clearing, hidden among the trees. Nicky had been found, but as many had feared, he was no longer alive. The news spread through the camp and the village like a shockwave. People fell to their knees in disbelief, tears streaming down their faces as the reality of what had happened set in. For Nicky's parents, the grief was unbearable. Their son was gone, and they were left with nothing but unanswered questions and an unimaginable loss. The days following Nicky's discovery were a blur of grief and confusion. An autopsy was performed, but could not conclusively determine a cause of death. His body did not show any obvious signs of physical trauma, further complicating the investigation. Over time, signs of possible sexual abuse were considered, but that was never officially confirmed. What was clear, however, was that something was terribly wrong. Nicky had not simply wandered off and gotten lost. He had been found lying in an area that had already been searched, raising suspicions that he had been placed there after the fact. His clothes were disheveled, and there were troubling signs that he may have been the victim of sexual assault. The police launched an intensive investigation, but from the start they faced enormous challenges. There were no witnesses, no clear suspects, and the remote location of the campsite made it difficult to piece together what had happened in the critical hours between Nicky's disappearance and the discovery of the body. As weeks turned into months, and months into years, the investigation into Nicky Verstappen's death seemed to stall. Despite exhaustive efforts, including interviews with over 100 people, forensic testing, and appeals for information, the case remained unsolved. Nicky's family was left in limbo, their grief only intensified by the lack of answers. For years they fought to keep the case in the public eye, refusing to let their son's memory fade into obscurity. Crime journalist Peter R. de Vries played a crucial role in this effort as well. He consistently kept the case in the spotlight through media attention, offering support to Nicky's family and urging law enforcement to continue their pursuit of justice. But as time passed, hope began to fade. It seemed as though Nicky's death would remain a mystery, a cold case never to be solved. It wasn't until nearly 20 years later that the investigation took a dramatic turn. Advances in DNA technology allowed the police to revisit old evidence. Peter R. de Vries, the crime journalist, had been a driving force behind the push for large-scale DNA testing. And finally, after years, a breakthrough. DNA samples taken from Nicky's clothing were reanalyzed and a match was found. The DNA belonged to 55-year-old Jos Brech, a survival expert and former scout leader with experience living off the grid. Brech was known for spending extended periods in remote areas and had a history of inappropriate behavior with minors. He had worked with scouting groups in Heerlen and Nut, and later at a daycare center in Brunsum, near the Brunsumer Heide. He had once been the suspect of a sexual abuse case at the daycare, though the charges were dropped. In 2010, when 107 men were asked to voluntarily submit DNA samples in a new investigation, Brech was not included, because the police had no reason to suspect him at the time, and the investigation had yielded no results. On the morning of August 10, 1998, Brech had been cycling near the area where Nicky's body was later found. He was stopped by the police and claimed that he was simply heading home. And although a report was filed, he wasn't considered a suspect. He was only viewed as a coincidental passerby. Questioned twice as a witness, nothing raised suspicions about his involvement in the case, and he was dismissed due to a lack of concrete evidence. In 2017, as the cold case team continued their work, they decided to invite 1,500 men for DNA testing. And for the first time, Brech was among them. However, he ignored the request and refused to participate, even when the police visited his home twice to ask for his cooperation. In April 2018, Brech disappeared after being asked to submit his DNA for the large-scale screening. He had last been seen in the Vosges region in France, where he had been living a solitary life in the wilderness, His family reported him missing, leading to a missing persons investigation. And as part of that investigation, police collected DNA samples from Brech's personal belongings at his home, which were then matched to the DNA found on Nicky Verstappen's clothing. And this crucial match made Brech a prime suspect. The international manhunt for Brech led police to track him to Spain, where he had been spotted by hikers in the remote forest near Castellterçol, a village north of Barcelona. Brech was finally arrested on August 2018 by Spanish police, and shortly after he was extradited to the Netherlands. Brech's trial began in early 2020, nearly 22 years after Nicky's death. The courtroom was packed with journalists, legal experts, and members of the public, all eager to finally see justice served after all those years. The prosecution presented a case built on the DNA evidence that placed Brech at the scene. They argued that he had abducted, assaulted, and killed Nicky before hiding his body in the woods. But Brech maintained his innocence, claiming that he had simply stumbled across Nicky's body while out for a walk and he had panicked, fearing that he would be blamed for the boy's death. However, the fact that Brech's DNA had been found on Nicky's underwear made it highly unlikely that he had simply stumbled upon the body. The trial was a grueling process, with emotional testimonies from Nicky's family and heated debates over the strength of the DNA evidence. Throughout the trial, frustration mounted over Brech's unwillingness to talk about what had really happened. His refusal to provide further details about Nicky's death and his final moments left the boy's family and the public desperate for answers that never came, deepening the emotional toll of the case. But in the end, the court found Brech guilty of all charges, sentencing him to 12.5 years in prison. For Nicky's parents, Bertie and Peetje, the verdict brought some sense of closure. But the pain of losing their son would never truly go away. They had fought for justice for more than 2 decades, and while they had finally received it, the emotional toll of those years was immeasurable, especially because although the perpetrator had been caught, there were still so many questions unanswered about what exactly happened on the night of Nicky's death. Although this story is absolutely devastating, it is also one of perseverance in the face of overwhelming grief, demonstrating that even after so many years, there is still hope for justice. This case serves as a powerful reminder of the incredible advancements in technology that can bring long-forgotten cases back into the light, offering hope that future cases, no matter how old, can still be resolved. Cases like this remind us of the importance of never giving up, of holding on to hope even when it seems impossible. And with that, we conclude today's episode. Thank you so much for listening. Be sure to subscribe and leave a review. And don't forget to follow The Lowest Crime on Instagram to find all images related to the case. Also, feel free to leave a comment. I'd love to hear more about the people that listen. I look forward to seeing you in the next one.